I still remember that Friday night like it was yesterday, not because anything dramatic was supposed to happen, but because it started so normal that my mind almost missed the moment everything shifted. I was driving back down County Road 14 outside a small town in western Oregon, the kind of place where nothing really changes for years. Same trees, same gravel shoulders, same old streetlights buzzing like they are tired of staying on. I had worked late, I was hungry, thinking about microwaving whatever was left in the fridge and calling it a night. But then I turned onto my road, and something fell off in a way I cannot explain at first, like the air itself had been rearranged, and that is the first 3 seconds of it. The second is when I saw headlights where there should not have been any, scattered across my field like fireflies trapped in metal boxes. And the third is when I realized my fence line was gone in places it had no right to be gone. Not broken, not weathered, but cut. Clean, like someone had decided my property was optional. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I have lived on that land for 22 years, long enough to know every dip in the soil and every tree that bends a little too far when the wind comes in from the west. I bought it when it was cheap and empty and mostly forgotten, built a small house with my own hands and a stubborn kind of patience. And I put up that fence myself with posts set deep enough to survive anything short of a storm that wanted to erase me. So when I stepped out of my truck that night and saw 30, maybe 40 cars sitting on my grass like it belonged to nobody, I did not feel anger first. I felt disbelief, like my brain refused to accept what my eyes were reporting. Then I walked closer, and the disbelief turned into something colder, because I saw the cut wire, folded back neatly, almost politely, like whoever did it wanted to pretend it was temporary, like they expected me to understand. Beyond that fence, my field had become a parking lot. SUVs lined up in rows, sedans squeezed in tight, a couple pickup trucks half-parked on the edge like they were afraid of being caught, and I could hear music in the distance, bass thumping faintly from the new restaurant that had opened next door only a week earlier, a place called Millstone Grill, big opening banners, string lights, the kind of place that looks like it was designed to be seen on social media more than to exist in real life. I stood there for a moment, just taking it in, trying to find some reasonable explanation that did not involve what I already knew was true. Then I heard voices and laughter drifting over the fence line, casual, comfortable, like nothing in the world was wrong. So I followed it. I walked across my own field, stepping between cars that were not mine, and by the time I reached the edge of the restaurant lot, I could feel my pulse in my ears. Inside it was packed. Warm lights, music too loud. People holding drinks like they were celebrating something important. I pushed through until I found someone who looked like they belonged in charge. A man behind the bar with a clipboard, and that tired smile managers wear when they think everything is under control. I pointed out the window without saying anything at first, just let him look, and he did, glanced, shrugged like it was nothing, and said everyone parks there, it is easier. I remember blinking at him because I genuinely thought I had misheard, so I asked him again, slower this time, who gave you permission to cut my fence and use my land? And he leaned on the bar like I was asking a ridiculous question and said, it is just grass, man. It grows back. That was the moment something in me settled, not exploded, not snapped, just settled into a decision that felt strangely calm. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just nodded once, turned around, and walked back out into the night air. And I remember thinking how strange it is that people can look at something that belongs to someone else and convince themselves it is empty just because they want it to be. When I got back to my house, I went straight to the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I almost never open, and pulled out the folder I keep for exactly the kind of situation you hope never happens. Inside was my survey map, my deed, the original county boundary records stamped and dated. I spread them on the table and just looked at them for a moment. Not because I doubted them, but because I needed to remind myself what reality actually was. Then I picked up the phone. First call was to the county non-emergency line. Calm voice, simple words. I reported trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized vehicle access. Second call was to a towing company out of Bend that I had used once years ago when a contractor left equipment on my driveway and forgot to come back for it. The owner still remembered me. Third call was to my insurance agent, just to make a record of the damage because I had learned a long time ago that paperwork is louder than anger in the long run. I did not rush any of it. I just spoke slowly, clearly, like I was describing something happening to someone else. And when I hung up, I sat there for a few seconds listening to the silence in my house. Then I looked out the window toward the field and saw something that made everything feel even more unreal. Because in the distance I could already see headlights turning onto my road that did not belong to the restaurant. I grabbed my jacket and walked back outside, and by the time I reached the fence line again, I heard the low, heavy rumble of a tow truck engine coming closer, followed by the faint flicker of red and blue lights. And that is where things started to shift from something happening to me into something that was about to happen to them, and I did not know it yet. But the night had already moved past the point of negotiation. By the time I got back to the fence line, the tow truck was already turning off the main road like it had been waiting somewhere just out of sight, and right behind it was a county patrol cruiser moving slow, careful, the kind of slow that means the officer already knows this is going to be paperwork before it is anything else. I remember standing there with my hands in my jacket pockets watching both vehicles roll into my property like they belonged there more than the cars that were still sitting across my field. And for the first time that night, I felt something shift from shock into structure. Like the situation was finally being seen through the right lens. The officer stepped out first, middle-aged guy, flashlight in hand, not aggressive, just observant. He walked the broken fence line without saying much, crouched down where the wire had been cut clean, ran his light along the edges, then followed the tire tracks through the grass like he was reading a story written in dirt. I stayed quiet, let him work, because I have learned over the years that the loudest person in a situation like this is usually the one least likely to be right. After a minute, he asked me for documentation. I handed him the folder, deed, survey map, county boundary lines, everything stamped and official. He compared it with what he was seeing on the ground, then looked back toward the restaurant lights glowing through the trees like a separate world, trying to pretend it was not part of this. He did not say much, just nodded once. That small motion that tells you the conversation has already ended in your favor. And then he called in the tow trucks. After that, everything started moving fast in a very controlled way, like a machine had finally been switched on. The first vehicle was hooked within minutes. Lift, chain, pull, the sound of metal shifting under weight, and then the car was gone. Lifted off my field like it had never belonged there at all. I stood there watching the process repeat, one after another. Cars that had been neatly arranged like they were permanent suddenly becoming temporary problems being removed. That is when the restaurant started to wake up to what was happening. People began walking out in groups, holding drinks, laughing at first like it was some kind of misunderstanding, until they saw their cars being lifted. Then the tone changed. Confusion first, then irritation, then panic. Someone shouted that their keys were inside. Someone else was already calling someone else. Phones everywhere. Voices overlapping, and I just stood there because there was nothing for me to add to it. The reality was already doing the talking. About 20 minutes in, the manager from earlier came rushing out through the side door. Same clipboard gone now, replaced by a face that had completely lost its confidence. He walked straight toward me, and the officer like he expected his presence alone to reverse what was happening. He pointed toward the tow trucks and said something about misunderstanding, about customers, about parking arrangement. I remember the officer raising his flashlight slightly, not threatening, just enough to make the point that attention was now on him, and asking him very calmly if he had any permission to alter property boundaries or use adjacent land for commercial parking. There was a pause there, a real one, not dramatic, just empty, the kind of pause where a person realizes every answer. They have leads in the wrong direction. The manager looked at me then, trying to find something softer in my expression, maybe sympathy, maybe hesitation, and I remember how strange it felt to realize I had none of either left to give. He tried one more angle, said it was just grass, that nobody got hurt, that they were trying to run a business, and I finally spoke for the first time since I had returned. I told him it was not just grass, it was property, it was registered land with a recorded boundary, and it was not his decision to redefine that because his parking lot was full. That was when his expression changed, not to anger first, but to something closer to fear, because I think he finally understood this was not a neighborly disagreement. This was already inside a legal framework that he had walked into without looking. Meanwhile, the tow trucks kept working. One by one, the cars disappeared, each one triggering a different reaction from the crowd. Some people arguing, some begging, some just standing in disbelief watching their night turn into something expensive and irreversible. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I noticed something quiet that stuck with me more than the chaos. The field itself, emptying, slowly returning to what it had always been, just land under open sky. That contrast between how quickly something can be occupied and how quickly it can be taken back when the rules are finally enforced. After the last few cars were being hauled away, the restaurant owner himself came out. The actual owner this time. Not the manager, older, sharper, the kind of man used to being listened to. He walked toward me with that controlled anger people use when they still think they can reshape a situation with words. He said, "We can fix this. We will pay for the fence. We will compensate you. We can even lease the land for parking." Like it was just another business problem to solve with a contract. I remember looking past him for a moment at the emptying field and thinking how fast entitlement turns into negotiation when consequences show up. I told him no. Just that. No explanation, no speech. And for the first time his confidence cracked, not loudly. Just a small visible shift in posture. Like the ground under him was no longer as certain. He tried again, softer this time. But the tow truck behind him lifted the last of the cars as he spoke, and whatever leverage he thought he had disappeared with it. The officer finished his notes. The trucks left one by one, and the field went quiet again. Except now it was the kind of quiet that feels earned, not empty. And I stood there longer than I needed to just listening to it, because I knew the next part was not about removal anymore. It was about what gets rebuilt after something like this. The next morning didn't feel like a victory at first. It felt more like exhaustion finally catching up with me. The kind where your body is calm, but your mind is still replaying everything on its own. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I slept well, but because I kept seeing headlights in my head every time I closed my eyes. When I stepped outside with my coffee, the air was cold and clean. That early Oregon kind of quiet where even the wind feels like it is trying not to disturb anything. And the first thing I noticed was how different my field looked without the cars. It was just grass again, flattened in places. Tire tracks pressed deep like temporary memories that hadn't decided if they were going to fade or stay. The fence line was still broken in one section, but now it looked smaller somehow. Less like a disaster and more like a problem that had already started being solved. I stood there for a long time just watching it, thinking about how strange it is that something can feel so overwhelming at night and so manageable in the morning, like reality needs daylight to behave properly. Around mid-morning my phone rang, and I already knew before I picked it up that it would be about the restaurant, the owner this time, not the manager. His voice was different immediately, still careful, but missing that earlier arrogance. Like someone who had spent the night realizing exactly where the lines were drawn and what happened when you stepped over them. He started with an apology, not the casual kind either, but the structured kind. The kind where every sentence has already been weighed for damage control. He said they had reviewed everything, that there was no misunderstanding anymore, that what happened should not have happened. Then he moved into solutions, real ones this time. They would pay for full fence replacement, not patchwork, not repair, a complete rebuild with proper materials. They would install concrete barriers on their side to make sure no vehicle could ever cross again. They would cover towing costs, property damage, and any administrative fees related to the incident. And most importantly, they would sign a formal agreement, recognizing the boundary line and explicitly prohibiting any use of my land under any circumstance. I didn't say much while he was talking. I just let him fill the silence because I've learned over time that people don't just talk to communicate, they talk to reduce pressure. And if you let them keep going, the truth usually comes out on its own without you having to dig for it. When he finally stopped, I asked him one simple question. Why did you think it was okay in the first place? There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected, and then he said something honest in a way I don't think he intended. He said they thought it wouldn't matter, that it was just in used land, that nobody would notice or care enough to make it a problem. And that was the part that stayed with me more than anything else. Not the fence being cut, not the cars, but the assumption behind it. The idea that something becomes available just because it is not actively defended every second of every day. I told him I wasn't interested in negotiating anything after the fact, because once someone makes a decision about your property without you, the conversation changes permanently. It stops being about convenience and starts being about respect. He accepted that without arguing, which honestly surprised me more than anything that had happened the night before. Maybe because he already understood there was no version of this where pushing back would make things better. The surveyor came out 2 days later, A quiet guy with a clipboard and bright markers. Walking the line slowly like he was reminding the ground what it was supposed to be. Flags went into the grass every few feet. Sharp little reminders that ownership is not a feeling. It is a record. After that, the construction crew arrived. They didn't talk much, just worked, pulling out the old posts, setting new steel ones deeper than before, tightening the wire so there was no room for interpretation anymore. On the restaurant side, I watched them pour concrete barriers in a row, heavy gray blocks that looked simple but felt final, like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence nobody could misread. During those days, I found myself walking out there more than I expected, not because I was angry anymore, but because I was trying to understand how quickly people normalize crossing lines when nothing stops them, how a boundary can exist physically and still be mentally ignored if it isn't enforced, and I kept thinking back to that first moment in the restaurant when the manager shrugged and said it's just grass, because that sentence, more than anything else, explained everything that followed. A week later, the restaurant reopened its parking situation, this time with signs that actually meant what they said, directing customers to proper parking areas nearby. Some people complained at first, of course they did, but people adapt faster than they protest when they still want the food, and within a few days, everything stabilized in a way that made the whole incident feel almost surreal in hindsight, like a short disruption that exposed something bigger underneath it. My field went back to being just land again, quiet, open, unchanged in the way land always is when people stop trying to redefine it. But I still found myself checking the fence sometimes at night, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit, like my mind needed proof that order had actually returned and wasn't just temporary. And maybe the part one didn't expect was how little satisfaction I felt at the end of it, not because I thought it should have gone differently, but because once everything was resolved, I realized the conflict itself had taken more energy than the outcome ever returned. It wasn't revenge that stayed with me. It was the reminder of how thin the line is between convenience and entitlement, between assumption and violation, and how quickly people can cross it when they think no one is watching closely enough. So if there is anything left to say after all of it, it's probably this. Most problems don't start as conflicts. They start as small decisions that someone assumes won't matter. And those are usually the ones that cost the most when they finally do. I don't know if I handled it the best way. I just know I handled it the way I had to once I understood what was really happening. And I am curious what you would have done if you walked outside and found your property already being used like it didn't belong to you. Would you have tried to reason more? Would you have escalated faster? Or would you have waited for the system to step in the same way I did? Because honestly, I think that answer says more about people than the situation itself. And if you made it this far, I appreciate you listening. If you want more stories like this, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.